Draft development contributions policy. Now, just to be clear, we need to make a decision on this today because it's important that it goes out for consultation so it can be
Yes.
baked into the annual plan.
Correct.
Righty-o. Thank you.
So this report was left to lie on the table at the December Finance and Performance Committee meeting, pending an additional workshop with staff. That workshop occurred on the 4th of February, and we're bringing this report back for your reconsideration, seeking your endorsement to go out for consultation. Consultation will run from the 25th of February through to the 26th of March, with hearings to occur in April alongside the annual plan. Those consultation dates were circulated to you with a memo that was sent out on Friday. Also in that memo was some information regarding DC rebates. That's outside the scope of this policy, but we will be bringing a briefing to you in the coming months on DC rebate schemes and the DC rebate policy. There's also been some discussion around having more regular updates of the schedule of assets to reflect the Council's current capital program. We are looking to move to annual updates of the schedule of assets once this review is finished, but we need to work out how that will work in practice. There was also a question around how changes to the capital program to address deliverability will impact DC charges. So the DC model does factor in when a project will be delivered as part of the calculation for that DC charge for that project. So if a project delivery date changes, we do update the model to reflect that, and that will generate next time the model is run as part of the review. So the model is designed to ensure that the Council's total cost to deliver the growth component of an asset after you account for interest and inflation is recovered entirely from DCs. So if you push the project out, those funding considerations around interest and inflation could impact that DC charge. But we expect that change would likely be minor. The DC charge wouldn't necessarily go down though, because the model uses inflation-adjusted capital expenditure figures for projects that will be delivered in the future. It's difficult to speak in terms of hypotheticals, but we think the charge would likely be minor because if the project remains in the capital program, because we'll still collect DCs for it, it's just those funding implications that change. And then we did just want to draw your attention to one minor change that has occurred to the policy from when it was tabled in December. And this pertains to lots that were created after the 1st of July 2004, which is when we first started charging for DCs, where DCs have not been paid at the point of subdivision. So our practice is that we do not give credit for lots that were created where DCs were not paid. The policy is really clear on this with respect to non-residential sections, but it's less clear for residential, and we think the policy would do with some clarification. So we've added an additional sentence just to clarify that for a residential lot created after the 1st of July 2004, when we first started charging DCs, if DCs were not paid, you do not get credit for that site. So that's it.
That's it. Good-to-go.
Thank you.
Tyler, please.
Oh, no, I was just happy to move if no one else wants to.
Okay. Yep, Andre? Sorry.
Thank you. Just on a rebate scheme, so I'm just trying to understand the logic of doing a scheme later, or also get an idea of when that would happen, because would that happen before there's a final plan adopted between the draft and then? Is that when a rebate scheme would look at, or when would that be looked at?
So the rebate policy sits outside the DC. There's a separate policy.
Yep.
So we could look to introduce rebate schemes whenever. So we've currently got 2 that are open, but it would be up to the council what you were interested in terms of what kinds of developments you wanted to incentivise.
Yep.
So that briefing is really just to get an idea of what council's actually interested in terms of a rebate scheme, but it's a separate decision to this policy.
So it sits outside this policy.
Because in this policy it mentions things like a lesser amount for 1 bedrooms, for example. So that kind of thing's built into this policy.
The small residential unit adjustment.
Yeah.
Yes, so that's changing. We're currently adjust based on gross floor area.
Yep.
But we're moving to bedrooms because we have census data that supports that there are fewer people when the bedroom sizes get smaller. So with 1 bedroom units, I think that's about 1.5 average people, which is sort of reflected in
Yep.
the assumptions that are built into the policy around what does an average property look like.
Yeah, and it makes heaps of
That's
sense.
separate.
But this is being built into the policy and not a rebates policy.
So that's
So
just-
I guess what I'm trying to get my head around is why we wouldn't be considering other things we want to do as part of this policy, like that one.
So the policy makes assumptions around average demand for a household. So that is a HUI, a household unit equivalent. And those assumptions are built into all of the DC charges. So when we do that, we have to figure out, well, what is an average household and what is an average household demand on council infrastructure. So we think it's fair to recognise that 1 bedroom units have put less demand on council infrastructure because there's less people living there. So the policy provides an adjustment for those 1 bedroom units to receive a less DC, I think it's 0.6 of a HUI is what they'll be charged within the policy. That's a policy rule, I suppose. Whereas the DC rebates is for council to say there's certain types of development that you would like to incentivise. You can't necessarily make a ton of changes in the DC policy in terms of the charges because the LGA is quite prescriptive, and so you're going to use a DC rebate scheme to influence how much a developer might need to pay. So we have rebate schemes that are currently 100% of the DC charge, but other councils provide reductions through rebate schemes, so they might pay half for a certain type of development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And just on the road network catchment of DCs, is that covering things like resurfacing in areas being, hammered with trucks, this kind of thing?
It's all transport. So road. Yeah.
Only the growth-related portion. So, you need to come down.
You need to come to the table, sorry.
The road network charges include all transport costs, but they are growth-related costs. So some of our programs are completely renewals, but any that have growth-related portions, we have identified and include that in the schedule of assets.
Cool. Yeah. So I'll take questions offline for specifics, but presumably roads like Marshes Road, which is getting hammered from truck movements from building homes. So I'm trying to get my head around how we're using DCs for those types of projects, and indeed Hallsville Junction Road.
For sure. It's probably more detail would be easier offline. But there are a number of factors. So we have, in some cases, developer agreements with the developer that might cover resurfacing of roads if it's a large subdivision, for example, and the road outside gets damaged due to their trucks, then we can have a developer agreement based on that, which is completely separate. Like it's a standalone agreement, not part of the DC policy.
Cool. Thank you.
Victoria?
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got some questions around 5.18 and 5.19 on the paper on page 31. Can I just clarify then, when you're talking about a rebate scheme, following on from Councillor Moore's questions, does the rebate scheme relate to rates, whereas what we're talking about here is solely DCs? Or are you anticipating that a rebate scheme that's going to come to us at a later date is also going to include rebates for DCs? I'm just struggling to understand that.
So at the last briefing, we were requested, there was some discussion around DC rebates, and we were asked to come back with a briefing on DC rebate schemes with the idea that council could use them to incentivise certain types of development. So it sits outside this policy, and the funding implications for rebate schemes would also sit outside the policy as well.
But that the difference would have to be, if you rebated development contributions, the difference would have to be covered by rates.
Yes, or a non-DCE source, which is usually rates. So any
But that
time that council chooses to require less DCs than what is generated by the DC calculation, which we've talked through in previous briefings, that can't be covered by other ratepayers because that's capacity that development has taken up. So it has to be covered from a non-DC source.
That would be a conscious decision that council makes, and to encourage a particular outcome.
Okay, so can we have a look at attachment B on page 38 of the agenda? Can we pull that up, please? I got the right page.
Well,
There's a table. We've got a table.
Does anyone want to second this, please? Mark, thank you.
Yeah.
Same.
I'm just on page 38 of the agenda in your table. You're talking about the remission that's there, and you say the developer must write to the chief executive. I'm in the options category. Developer must write to the chief executive seeking a remission and explaining how the development has met this threshold and why the council should grant a full or partial remission. Is that what we're doing presently, or is that what you're anticipating going forward?
So the remission clause currently requires someone seeking a remission to write to the chief executive, usually via the DC team, to request a remission and outline the reasons that they think that their development is unique and compelling. What we are suggesting is that we remove this clause from the policy, but an alternative is to clarify the council's intent for a remission, that it would... the development itself is unique and compelling, not the developer. And so the provisions that are in the alternative drafting is still that the developer needs to write to the chief executive to outline why the development is unique and compelling.
I'm a little bit concerned about some of the wording that you've got in that alternative provision, where it's the development itself, not the developer or the future user, because I don't understand how you can determine the development itself without actually considering the future user. So I'm just struggling to see how that particular wording would apply, and perhaps you can give me an example on how or when you envisage that the alternative remission policy would be used, and also the wording that you're using about not creating a new precedent. Have you used that sort of wording before in our policies? Because it seems overly complicated to me from a policy perspective.
So the issue we have with remissions currently is the threshold for unique and compelling is intended to be high. It's intended to address a matter about a DC assessment that was not considered by the policy when the policy was drafted. So there's something about the development that is so unique that the assessment cannot reflect or does not accurately reflect the development, and we need to address that via a remission.
Forgive me, Ellen, I do understand that, and I remember when we applied it in a recent decision at the table. What I'm concerned about is that the alternative wording that we've got is particularly onerous, and I can't for the life of me imagine how it would actually work. I can't see the benefit in it.
That's kind of the point, because the remissions that have been granted up until this point, staff advice has been that they are not unique and compelling, that the council has just decided to remit the DC primarily because of the developer or what the site is going to be used for, which was not the intent of the remission clause in the first place. It was to address the assessment. Potentially, if the council was looking to waive DCs for certain types of developments, then a rebate policy might be a better way of dealing with it, and then it doesn't require every decision to have to come to council for consideration each time. It's just dealt with as part of the rebate scheme.
Sorry, I think I'm going around in circles now. Can you give us an example of when you anticipate that the newly drafted alternative provision would apply successfully?
So the rebate is intended, or the remission, is intended to address something that isn't considered by the policy. So it's something that we haven't thought about in drafting the policy so that it can be addressed.
So it is a high bar, but no, we can't give you a specific
It's
example.
so high, David, that you can't for the life of you ever imagine when you're going to use it.
If you knew the example, you would have put it in.
Exactly.
In the policy.
Yeah.
That's what it's saying.
Yeah.
I said if they could think of the example, they would have actually embedded it in
Okay.
the policy rather than have it in.
Yeah.
On the
But we can
rebate
get
scheme.
feedback through that through the consultation as well, of course, and we can come back in terms of a rebate policy to talk to that issue.
Because within the policy is a lot of assumptions about average demand of different types of developments. But sometimes there are developments that we haven't considered in building in those averages. And so it's just intended to be a way for the council to address that. Yeah.
I think the biggest issue that I have is around separating out the rebate from the remissions for a conversation at a later date, when in fact they should all be part of the same conversation and aligned. And I really don't think that I've got a straight answer on why we're not doing it all together.
So the rebate policy it's intentionally specific from DCs because it's a way for you to address a DC charge without addressing it within the policy, because the LGA doesn't allow you to do that. So we've kept it separate. So it's an intentional decision that council makes to address a strategic development goal that you have by waiving a DC requirement
Outside of the DC
outside
policy.
the policy.
So DCs are bound by the legislation. A rebate could be something like an incentive to build eco-friendly homes or a development. That would be something that would be a rebate, but it couldn't be embedded in the DC policy. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe the final question is around some assurance that as elected members we will still have an opportunity to influence the rebates and the remissions in the event that something comes before us that we feel very strongly about. And I don't want to be precluded from a policy in doing that.
Yeah.
The rebate criteria is approved by council when they come up for reconsideration or we're proposing a new one. So that's where you would have an opportunity to provide direction on what exactly you wanted to be rebating. And we currently have a limit in the criteria that we have for social housing and papakainga, that you over a certain threshold it would come to finance and performance for your approval anyway. So that criteria is approved by council, and then remissions are always approved by council.
So you have that opportunity.
Apologies to my colleagues for making a meal out of that, but I was just struggling with it. Thank you.
That's good. That's good.
Aaron, please.
Yeah, mine's just one that was raised from some people in my area around when the government were talking last year around granny flats and stuff. They were going to make a whole lot of changes around them going in a lot easier. Will they still incur DCs? And is there a size of a granny flat that doesn't?
Is this the fast track approvals?
Yeah, that because they wanted people to be able to build tiny units in their backyards for grandma or their teenage
the granny
son.
flats.
Yeah.
So the consultation document discussed DCs and recognised that our only triggers to require DCs is a consent, and what's being proposed is that a consent is not required. So we are waiting to see what this legislation looks like.
Is it a resource or a building consent that triggers it?
My understanding is the granny flats proposal was that both are not required under what is proposed. So we don't have a trigger to charge DCs under the current proposal. There is legislation coming, I understand, this year, and we'll see exactly what levers the government want to give us to charge DCs for granny flats. Our policy does require granny flats to pay DCs as a small residential unit.
So they will be charged unless the policy that the government puts out says they don't.
Yeah, unless the government doesn't give us a specific trigger to charge DCs for granny flats, in which case we can't, because the legislation doesn't allow. The LGA allows us to charge for subdivisions, land use and building consents, and then service connections. So if the government gives us a trigger, then we will charge DCs for granny flats.
Right. And they haven't given a word on which way. I'm assuming they'd be aiming to not charge for it because the DCs will be as much as the granny flat in some cases.
I suspect that's the case, yes.
Okay, right. Samuel?
Sorry, it's probably a bit on Vic's stuff, so it may not be that helpful, but I'm going to ask anyway. So how would we go about, I'm just thinking, and it was back to James's questions, I think it was last year, we were talking about the DCs in terms of the CBD or the 4 Avs and driving, more, building and activity and things like that. If I take an example like the Dirty 30 list of buildings, how would we go about not DCing those buildings to encourage them to hurry up and get done?
So we've had the rebate schemes in the past. We had them for residential development in the 4 Avs and then non-residential development in the business zone.
Yep.
And that rebated 100% of DCs. That was a schemes that the council agreed to and then were implemented by our DC assessment team. Yep. So we would have a briefing to get a feel exactly what you are interested in terms of schemes, and then we would draft up some criteria for your consideration to make sure that we are targeting the developments that you actually do want to incentivise.
So that comes back to your rebate scheme. Yep. What you want to incentivise.
So then, sorry, and I may have missed it. So the time, so we go out for consultation on this, but the timings of that other piece of work, what does that look like?
We haven't. We're going to come back and do a briefing on it to get an understanding of what your views are, and then from there we'll program that and schedule that in.
Okay, but is that a year? Is that 2 years? Is it?
We could probably do it fairly quickly because we do already have rebate scheme criteria from our previous schemes, and if council was broadly happy with what we had before, then we could probably implement that quite quickly.
That would be quite good. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Just a question for me before we move to Kelly. We've now got the comparisons to what it was in 2016, then 21, and then what's in the draft. And because I was doing a bit of development years ago, take the likes of what we got here, East Linwood was in 2016 just over 20 grand. And then it went to just below 10, and now it's gone up to more or less 30. Is it all of those ones that are low? Is that because of COVID? Did we not get much done, or what? Why did we drop it so? We kind of finished all those jobs. There must have been a reason. Because if you look at it from a developer's point of view, if they were happy, probably weren't happy with paying 20 grand in 2016. If it dropped down to say 18 or 17 or something. The increase, because you say, it was 10 and now it's 30, everyone's going to throw their hands in the air. But why did we not even it out?
I think Amy can answer that question quite quickly.
So you'll remember we had a discussion a few weeks ago about the changes to the projections. The growth projections. So that middle one there, where it goes down quite a bit across the board, is where we were using projections from essentially with a 2013 census base. So they started with a 2013 base. In 2013, we were still experiencing rapid post-quake population growth. So we were a bit unusual in how much growth we were seeing over that point. Since then, Stats NZ have revised their projections, and they've revised them so that growth will happen at a slower rate. And we've come back to sort of where we were before the earthquake in terms of the level of growth. So that's why those look like they do. So the 2013 projections were unusual, and it's a good reminder that projections do change and they do respond to what's happening in the environment around them, and that's what you're seeing in here.
I think you did explain that last week. I just wanted everyone out there to hear it. Kelly, and then Yanni, I've got you.
Thank you. This is kind of following on a wee bit from Councillor Moore's question around subdivisions. in a specific case of a large retail development being set up, when does the window for DCs remain open? So in terms of do they pay up front when they submit their plans and get them approved? And then in the case of if they are actually causing significant damage to the road outside the place that they're building, does the window remain open for them to give money back? I'm not sure of the actual process.
So if you have a large non-residential development and that's staged, so each consent that comes in gets assessed for DCs, and so they kind of pay as they go for the most part.
Right.
So yeah, it's each consent that comes in gets assessed for DCs.
So if the road was actually being damaged outside the work and it could be attributed to their very large trucks, so that would be billed to them potentially?
So that would be outside the DC policy, as you heard previously. Yep.
Or maybe I didn't hear, but thanks.
Thank you. I know I have asked. Just one bit I'm trying to be clear on is the policy provides a set adjustment for one bedroom. This means the development contributions charge will better reflect the usually lower demand on infrastructure. So it's not just about what our goals might be or the city and etc., but it reflects the usually lower demand on infrastructure.
Yes.
So what I'm trying to figure out is why could a policy not also provide adjustments, for example, building 8 stories and above, because we get much more rates out of it, but the infrastructure demand is generally lower if you build something like that in the city. So I'm trying to figure out why nothing like that can be in the policy, but a set adjustment for one bedrooms could.
Because the policy makes, what is built into the policy is assumptions about average demand.
Yeah.
So we can make an adjustment to recognise that a certain development type puts less demand on council infrastructure. And with respect to non-residential development, there's a lot of, we call them Huey multipliers. It's basically the average demand for different development types are already built into the policy to recognise that different, so like warehouses have a different demand on council infrastructure than offices or retail or anything like that. So that is all built into the policy because that's about demand. But if you're talking about a multi-storey building, that demand is still assumed to be the same because it's based on gross floor area. So then if you're looking to incentivise it, that's different to saying this puts less demand on council infrastructure.
But the demand, so if an apartment building is built across the road here, the demand for infrastructure will be significantly less than building, if it's 100 apartments or whatever, then building 100 homes and needing new roads and parks, everything else. The demand for infrastructure is very, very different. So I'm just trying to figure out why
there's different components though. There's 3 water component, there's roading components.
Yes.
So those are different components that go into building up the development contribution.
Mm-hmm. And built into the policy is the assumption, so a HUE, a household unit equivalent, is the assumption as to what an average household is. So it's all sort of built into the policy. And I think an average household is 2.5 people. So if you had an apartment that was 1 bedroom, then you would assume that there is less people living in there based on census data versus a 4-bedroom home in a different, a standalone home.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm keen to get on to debate, but I've got Yanni and Sarah, so we'll do those just because we know lunchtime's arriving.
Thank you for the work you've done on that. Effectively, I just want to clarify basically the reason for the significant increase in DC charges into the Brownsfield area is because you've changed the water charges in the greenfields. So basically, the peninsula, Akaroa gets a subsidy now from people in Linwood.
So it's a couple of things. So we've had a few briefings on this where we talked about how DC charge is calculated. So it's the cost to deliver the infrastructure divided by the growth. So what we've had between 2021 and 2025 is the cost of infrastructure has gone up quite a bit. So $200 million additional growth capex between 2021 LTP and 2024 LTP. The inflation projections are a lot higher in the 2024 LTP, as are the interest costs. So that top line is a lot bigger than it was in 2021. And then obviously, as Amy has said, growth projections have decreased. We have also reconfigured the catchment boundaries for the water activities, for all of the activities, but for water specifically, to address some concerns that we had around the current catchments being too small and not providing enough flexibility for our asset planners. Right. So yeah, there's a combination of things that's happened to these charges, but it's not just the catchments, because what we have seen in projects that are charged at district-wide level, looking at where they were in 2021 and where they are in 2024-25, is they've basically doubled. So because they're just more expensive to deliver them for the council.
But relative to, and I'm just reading on the page 38, relative to the different charges in different neighbourhoods, the Three Waters one has the biggest impact in terms of the difference.
Yes.
And can you just, I'm still just trying to understand why people that would be doing like a additional unit in Linwood, for example, would be paying for like Three Waters infrastructure on the peninsula like in Akaroa.
So Akaroa is a different catchment to urban. So water supply has the urban and the Banks Peninsula catchment. Cool. Wastewater has urban, Banks Peninsula and Akaroa Harbour, right. And stormwater has urban and Banks Peninsula. And that is to reflect the integrated nature of the urban water network, in addition to providing greater flexibility. We've also talked in previous briefings that with changes to MDRS and Plan Change 14, that we don't have a great idea of where growth is going to occur, and our Three Waters asset planners need some flexibility in terms of being able to respond to growth that is occurring throughout the city. So that bigger catchment just gives them greater flexibility over the next couple of years. And next time we review the policy, we'll take another look at our catchments and see if maybe there's a better way of doing it, which we'll do every time we review the policy detail itself.
Okay, thank you.
Sarah, please, and then we'll debate.
Thank you. I'm just going to ignore the fact that we haven't signed off on MDRS, but move back to Andre's point about the infrastructure needs of apartment buildings, for example, as opposed to 100 apartments as opposed to 100 standalone small dwellings. Is it possible to redo the assumptions behind that as part of the policy at some stage? Because, for example, it's got an apartment building would have a much smaller footprint for stormwater and those kind of things than 100 standalone dwellings, and use of water is probably lower as well because you're not having the gardens and those kind of things. Like, is there potential to change those assumptions to help lower the development costs and contributions from people who are increasing density, which is good for the city?
So that stuff is inherently built in at the growth modelling stage, which informs both the DCs but also the infrastructure and asset planning side of things. So when we're growth modelling, we have a bunch of inputs, including target densities and where there's vacant land and what households might look like. So it's built in back here.
So it is built in already.
And then once it gets to the DC policy, the asset planners have done what they need to do to plan for that growth, and we know how much growth is going to happen in that area in terms of households, and then that informs the policy in terms of the CapEx and the schedule of assets.
Okay, no, that's fine, because it just sounded earlier like we were assuming that they were the same impacts for both those HUEs. Okay, no, that's great, thanks.
Rightio, thank you. It's any debate or discussion? Andre?
Thank you. Yeah, I very much appreciate the staff, their patience and very detailed explanations. Thank them on the work on a very long, tedious process. A lot of these changes are making sense to me. As governance, we have to make sure that the changes on something like this are both fair but also reflective on the infrastructure costs required to build in a certain area. And for example, you build homes out in Halsall yet we have had to spend tens and tens of millions of dollars on new stormwater infrastructure. So the idea that a 5-bedroom home in Halswell being built on what was swampland just a few decades ago is paying the same amount towards stormwater infrastructure costs as a 2-bedroom apartment in the city just doesn't make any sense to me. Doesn't strike me as fair. And our policy all needs to try and reflect a commitment to reduce the rating burden in the city, not to add to it. When we keep building out and out and out, you need more parks, more roads to maintain, more stormwater infrastructure and basins and everything else. It ultimately all adds to the rating burden. Whereas you build an apartment building across the road from here, you get a very, very high rate take and a much lower infrastructure cost, and it ultimately helps reduce the rating burden. We also need a policy that reflects our goals. We want 20,000 people living in the central city. It's not going very well, we're a long way off, but tripling or almost quadrupling the DC costs in the inner city won't help us reach that either. So this policy appears to me to contradict our goals and efforts, and also our desire to reduce the rating burden. So I recognise that remodelling takes a number of months. We needed to have these type of debates before that modelling was done. But this is a policy decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It's actually one of the biggest decisions we'll make in a council term. So we do need to get it right. And we know that once a draft policy has gone out, it is very prescriptive as per the Local Government Act. So we'll be limited for what changes we can make before a final adoption. So to achieve our goals, a lot of rebates are going to be required, but they'll be really challenging to add later. They'll sound really good. But then when they come to us, we'll see it'll be a rating impact, and we'll get spooked out of it. That's going to be the cost. Ideally, we need to be modelling in as many things as possible now. And there are things that can be modelled in, and we need to be doing this kind of thing once and doing it right before we move on to looking at rebates later. So we've got a rare opportunity only once every few years for this policy to be in line with our goals, of which there are many. And I worry that we're going to miss that opportunity with this policy. So I won't be supporting this.
Victoria, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think you can tell from my earlier questions on this that I'm a little bit confused with some of it. Some areas I understand and I'm comfortable with, but there's just a couple of other areas that I don't have the degree of clarity that I require for my own personal decision making to be comfortable with it. I'm uncomfortable with separating some of this out and having to deal with the rebates at a later date. So I'm actually going to abstain today, and it's not because I think it's wrong, it's just that there's some aspects that I can't quite get right in my head. So I'm just explaining where I'll be abstaining today, thanks.
Okay. And Sam.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's been good. I appreciate the team taking the questions. I know we bumped it from last year. I guess there's a couple of things here. There are two distinct things. There's the DC policy and then the rebates, which are separate as well. And the rebates, in my mind, are going to be the aspirations we have for the city to drive particular outcomes. The example I use is the duty 30 list. You know, actually, maybe we need to be incentivising them to be done a lot quicker and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, hopefully we hear from a lot of people and a lot of people that are in this industry that, you know, we're not deciding on it today. But probably just the other point I'd make is that, you know, and I know, you know, we have different ways of dealing with things, but, you know, if people have got criticism stuff, there is a governance mechanism called amendments that can be put up today to deal with things. So, you know, I'm all for testing things with people if there are amendments that people want to put up, and we can have that debate. But simply saying it doesn't work isn't actually an answer. That's just saying it doesn't work. So use the process and the ability we have, you know, from being democratically elected to put amendments up if you want to get outcomes.
Rightio, we have a mover and sec. No, we haven't. We've got Yanni doing some debate.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I want to acknowledge that this is a really complicated issue and staff have done an incredible amount of work. We've had numerous briefings, and the longer we leave this policy from getting adopted, the more it actually costs us in real terms because of the significant increase to the cost of projects in our city. I welcome some of it, but I also have concerns about other parts of it. Probably my biggest concern is what's happening in the three waters around the zones. And if you look at effectively what we're doing, the preferred option is that Halswell, for example, gets a reduction from $15,000 for stormwater to $6,500, but people in Linwood go from $752 to $6,700. So effectively, people in Linwood have got a $6,000 increase, while the people in Halls will get nearly a $10,000 decrease. And if we want to get more dense as a city, if we want to encourage development happening within our brownfields, it does seem inherently unfair to have the greenfields getting subsidised by the incredible increase for the brownfield areas such as Linwood, and there's other ones in there, Papanui, for example. So, yeah, I appreciate what staff have done. The other one is that the wastewater collection charges have I think, gone citywide, or certainly to a larger catchment as well, which I think has had an impact on the peninsula having a discount or a reduction. But we're out for consultation. We need to hear from the community. I hope that we do have some flexibility when it comes back. I do acknowledge there's been a huge amount of work go into it, and I was heartened to hear that we should make more use of development agreements. That's something that I would strongly suggest that we need to have a really good look at as a council. When we see the cost of huge commercial developments going into some communities, or maybe it's even some residential in the subdivisions, the impact on that neighbourhood can be massive, and we always struggle to find costs or money to remedy the situation. And the classic example was the Langdon Road commercial development, and just the fact that ratepayers had to pick up the benefit to those private developers with all the increased traffic and associated costs. So thank you. I'm happy to support this going up for consultation, even though I do have some reservations, but I hope that we can get some public feedback, and hopefully we can have a degree of flexibility when we hear back.
Right, I'll put it. All those in favour? Against? And Vic's abstention. Who was no? Andre. Okay, that is carried. Now we'll move on to number 7, that I'm happy to move it and Kelly's happy to second it. And we have Andrew and Brent.